A humble woman took in an injured man, not knowing he was a hunted million. Night fell over the city, like a heavy gray curtain. Rain pounded the rooftops and empty streets, while an icy wind whistled through the alleyways. Everything seemed asleep, except for a distant engine, and hurried footsteps that vanished into the shadows. In a forgotten corner of the neighborhood, Emma was returning home after a long day cleaning offices. Her hair, carelessly pulled back, dripped under the worn hood of her coat. In her hands, a bag with some bread and tea, the only things she could afford that week. Her gaze, tired but gentle, avoided the shadows as she thought only of reaching her small refuge. But when she turned the corner, her heart stopped. In front of her door, under the flickering streetlight, there was a man lying on the steps. He seemed unconscious, his elegant suit torn and stained with blood. The rain carried a red thread that descended down the stairs. Emma stood motionless, clutching the bag in her hands. The man was breathing weakly, forming small clouds in the frozen air. She could have left, closed the door, and pretended not to see him. But something in his fragility stirred an unexpected impulse. "My God," she murmured, crouching beside him. The rain soaked her knees as she tried to move him. He was heavier than she thought, and she had to lean him against the wall before she could drag him inside, closing the door with her foot. Her room was on the second floor, with narrow stairs that creaked under both their weight. He mumbled incomprehensible things, names, numbers, and address. When she finally laid him on her bed, Emma sat beside him, breathing heavily. She didn't know who he was, or why he was bleeding, but something told her that this night he wasn't there by chance. She looked at him one last time, with a knot in her throat, and felt a chill, not just from the rain, but from the feeling that something big had just begun. A loud knock on the building door made her startle. Male voices could be heard from below, calling a name she didn't understand. Emma pulled back the curtain, and saw shadows moving under the rain, men in dark jackets, searching for him. She turned toward the stranger. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. His hands clenched as in a bad dream. For the first time she felt afraid of what she had just brought into her life. But the decision was already made. She took a deep breath, grabbed a towel and a bucket of water, and knelt beside him to clean his wound. And if this story has already touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. That night, the rain kept falling, and the knocking on the door didn't stop. Emma still didn't know that this would be the first of many nights when her life and her heart would be put to the test, because behind that elegant suit was a secret capable of destroying them both. And as the storm raged outside, Emma decided that at least for that night, he would find refuge in her. The shadows at the window grew longer, a harbinger of what was to come. The storm continued pounding the city, its monotonous rhythm filling every corner. In the room, barely lit by a dim lamp, the stranger slept, his face pale and covered with sweat. The wound on his side no longer bled as much, but Emma didn't stop watching him with concern. She leaned in to listen when he mumbled, barely audible, "The briefcase, no, don't hand it over." A chill ran down her spine. What briefcase? What did it mean? She tried to push away the questions. She prepared hot water, and looked for clean bandages in a drawer. When she returned, she noticed his tense expression, as if he were fighting even while asleep. The feeling that he was hiding something more than just a simple fortune became clearer. A creak on the stairs made her stop. She approached the door with her heart beating fast. The footsteps were firm, quick. Voices whispered just outside. "Are you sure it's here?" asked one. "I saw him go in. He has to be," replied another. The door handle turned slightly. Emma ran and turned the key, holding her breath. From the other side there was a brief silence, followed by a dry laugh. "Nothing. Let's search upstairs," said a voice. The footsteps slowly moved away. Emma released the air she didn't know she was holding, and collapsed into the chair. She looked at the bed. He was still sleeping, oblivious to the danger that lurked. The rain pounded the window harder. She thought about going out to seek help, but something told her that would only put them at greater risk. She breathed deeply, took the bandages and leaned over to treat him. He opened his eyes for an instant, confused, with a strange gleam. "Who are you?" he murmured. She barely replied. "The one who decided to save you tonight." His eyes closed again, defeated by sleep. Emma sat beside him, watching the door, with the feeling that the men would return, even though they had left. The storm was not over. The early morning advanced slowly, and the rain, though softer, continued tapping on the window, like a constant murmur. Emma fell asleep sitting in the chair, arms crossed and gaze fixed on him. It was the sound of a slight moan that woke her. The man was moving, eyes half open, trying to sit up. His breathing was heavy, and his hands searched for support on the blanket. Emma ran to his side and helped him lie back down. "No," he muttered. "Don't touch me." His tone was harsh, almost arrogant, but his body trembled, without strength to resist. Emma held his gaze serene. "I'm not doing it because you ask me to. I'm doing it because someone has to do it." He looked down, as if those words disarmed him a little. He breathed deeply, trying to compose himself. Only then did he notice the room properly. Humble walls, a table with dried flowers and old books, nothing like the places he was used to. "Where am I?" he asked, calmer. "In my house," she replied, changing the water in the bucket. "I didn't want to let you die in the street." He let out a low, bitter laugh. "Maybe you would have done well." Emma looked at him, for the first time with real hardness. "Maybe, but I'm not one of those who abandon someone like that." There was a strange silence between them. He closed his eyes, resting his head on the pillow, as if his strength betrayed him again. Even so, she could see something different in his expression. Not just fatigue, but a shadow of fear, and poorly disguised sadness. It was then, when in a low voice, barely a whisper, he spoke words that Emma didn't fully understand. "They can't find me. If they find me, it's not just about me." She frowned. "Who?" But she got no answer. He had fallen into restless sleep again. Emma watched him a moment longer, noticing that, despite his arrogance, something in him was crying out for help. Maybe he didn't even know it yet, but he wasn't just an injured millionaire. There was something darker hidden in his gaze, and that certainty began to grow inside her, silent, like the storm that refused to leave outside. In the gloom of the room, Emma decided not to ask herself more questions for that night. It was enough to keep him alive, at least until dawn, but as she covered him with the blanket, she couldn't help wondering what would happen when the door knocked again, because she knew, with the same clarity with which she felt the cold in her hands, that they would return, and the real test was just beginning. Dawn brought with it a false calm. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still covered the sky, tinting everything in opaque gray. Emma hadn't slept a wink all night, watching the man who continued lying in her bed. Every so often, he mumbled in dreams, turning his head as if escaping even while asleep. She got up to open the window a little, and let in fresh air. The neighborhood was still sleeping, with its empty sidewalks and dim facades, but at the end of the street, she managed to see something that disturbed her. A black car, parked right in front of the building, with the lights off and two figures inside. A chill ran down her spine. She closed the curtain immediately, trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but in her chest she knew it wasn't. Suddenly, he stirred in bed. He half opened his eyes, breathing deeply, his face contorted. He whispered. "They're close." Emma approached him quickly. "Who are they? Why are they chasing you?" He looked at her with a strange hardness, as if each word weighed. "It's not just about money, it's bigger. There are things you wouldn't understand." Emma pressed her lips. "You can try to explain to me," she replied, lowering her voice. "I'm not as naive as I seem." A heavy silence filled the room. He looked away, resting his head on the pillow, but something in his expression gave way, barely a hint of vulnerability showing on his face. "If they find me," he finally said, "they won't just finish me, you too." Emma felt a knot in her throat, but didn't pull away. Instead, she covered the wound on his side more carefully, as if that was enough to protect him from everything else. It was then when a dry noise at the door made her startle. 3 quick knocks, and a deep voice. "Sir, we know you're there. Don't make things more complicated." The man squeezed his eyes tightly, cursing under his breath. Emma stood motionless, holding her breath, while the shadows on the other side of the door projected long and threatening on the floor. She looked at him, and he shook his head, pleading, "Don't open for them." She nodded, determined. From the other side, the voice insisted, "You don't have to pay for someone you don't even know. Let him out, and nothing will happen to you." Emma clenched her fists, her heart beating like a drum. She approached the door, breathed deeply, and answered firmly,
"Shiz.
"There's no one here for you." A murmur of rage was heard on the other side before the footsteps moved away down the stairs. The man looked at her, with a mixture of surprise and mute gratitude. Emma sat beside him again, her hands still trembling. She didn't fully understand what she was getting into, but for some reason, she couldn't explain, she had already decided to risk it all for him. "And you, would you risk everything for someone you barely know? Tell me in the comments." He closed his eyes again, defeated by fatigue. Emma watched him a few more moments, convinced that this night would not be the last time she would have to face those shadows at the window, because the danger was just beginning. The silence of the next day brought no peace. The city roared outside with its usual noise, but in Emma's small room reigned a tense calm, as if at any moment the door could explode under a new blow. He was now more conscious, though his expression remained dim. He sat up with effort in bed, leaning against the wall. Emma watched him from the table, with a cup of cold tea in her hands. Finally he broke the silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They're not just looking for my money. If it were just that, they would have killed me already." Emma blinked, not fully understanding. "Then what are they looking for?" He raised his eyes once proud, now seemed tired. "Evidence. Evidence that could ruin more than one person, not just in my company. In the whole city." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Evidence of what?" He breathed deeply, as if each word were a weight. "Corruption, fraud, powerful people playing with lives, with hospitals, with schools. For years, I was part of them, until I decided to turn everything over." Emma looked at him incredulous. "Why?" A shadow of bitterness crossed his face. "Because I couldn't sleep peacefully anymore. Because I got tired of seeing how others suffered so that we could earn more. I thought I could fix it, but they found me first." She felt a knot in her throat. It was strange to see him like this. A man who on the outside remained elegant, even in his misery, but who inside was broken, pursued by the same hands that had once applauded him. He continued, in a thread of voice, "Everything is in a briefcase. Names, figures, contracts. I hid it before they caught up with me, but they'll find it, and if they do, nothing will change." For the first time, Emma understood that she wasn't just protecting a stranger, but someone who, with his decisions, had unleashed a war bigger than himself. He closed his eyes, lying back down, exhausted. She covered him with the blanket, in silence. Outside, the sky was clouding over again, and the distant rumble of thunder announced that the storm wasn't over. Inside, Emma felt a mixture of fear and respect, difficult to put into words. And as she watched him, with his chest rising and falling slowly, she knew she couldn't leave him alone in this fight. Although she hadn't confessed it yet, it was no longer just about saving his life. Now it was also her own conscience that asked her to stay by his side. The shadows of the previous night continued lurking, but she had already chosen her place. Night fell again over the city, and with it, the certainty that danger lurked behind every shadow. But inside that room, something different was beginning to emerge. Emma had prepared some soup, simple but hot. The smell filled the room when Ryan, leaning against the headboard, watched her in silence. It was the first time he really looked at her, without the cloud of fever, or the weight of fear. Her hair, still damp from the rain that caught her that afternoon, fell in dark strands over her face. She had red hands from the cold and skin, marked by fatigue, but there was a delicacy in her that disarmed even the most hardened. Emma noticed his gaze and raised an eyebrow, amused. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He looked down at the soup and murmured, "Because, I don't understand why you're still here." She shrugged, serving some in a steaming plate. "Because someone had to do it." He let out a small laugh, bitter, but sincere. Emma brought him the soup and helped him hold the spoon between his bandaged fingers. For several minutes they didn't speak anymore. Only the sound of metal hitting ceramic filled the silence. But little by little, something invisible was breaking the distance between them. He began to tell her small things, almost without realizing it. How he had grown up in a neighborhood similar to hers, before inheriting his father's company. How his mother taught him to play piano, and how the decisions he made took him away from everything that really mattered. Emma listened attentively, without interrupting. Sometimes she nodded, sometimes she just looked at him with those serene eyes that seemed to understand more than he said. When he finished eating, he lay back down, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I forgot what it was like to feel that someone cares for you without wanting anything in return," he confessed in a low voice. Emma looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. "And I forgot what it was like to feel that someone trusts me," she replied, barely a whisper. A soft silence enveloped them. For the first time since everything began, both felt less alone. In the gloom of the room, Emma sat beside him again, and for a moment their fingers brushed over the blanket. It was a small gesture, almost accidental, but enough to ignite something in both their chests. And so, while the city slept, Emma and Ryan began to discover that the true refuge is not always in the walls that protect us, but in the people who teach us to feel again. Outside, the night remained quiet, but they were no longer the same as they had been when the first rain fell. Dawn came with a more intense cold than usual. The sky, covered with heavy clouds, seemed to foretell what was to come. Emma was preparing coffee in the small kitchen when she heard a knock on the building door, dry, violent. She looked out the window just in time to see two men in black climbing the stairs of the outer courtyard, with determined steps. Her heart skipped a beat. She ran to the room and whispered to Ryan, who was still resting, "They're getting close again." He opened his eyes, alert, and sat up with difficulty. "We have to leave." Before he didn't finish the sentence. The apartment door shook under a strong punch and a deep voice roared on the other side. "We know who you are, Ryan. Don't drag her with you." Emma froze. She looked at Ryan, who avoided her gaze, teeth clenched. "Ryan," she murmured, taking a step back. "They said, your name." He said nothing. He just lowered his head as if that simple confirmation weighed more than all the wounds. "Are you who are you really?" asked Emma, her voice breaking. Finally he looked at her, and in his gaze, Emma saw no arrogance or pride, but a mute plea. "I wanted to tell you," he whispered, "but I didn't know how." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, and unable to bear it anymore, she turned around. "You lied to me," she exclaimed, her voice choked with rage and disappointment. "You brought this storm to my door. You used me." The knocks on the door echoed again. Ryan tried to get up, stumbling over the blanket, but Emma stopped him with a gesture. "Don't touch me," she screamed, cheeks flushed. Go before you destroy me too." He looked at her, motionless, as if those words pierced him deeper than any bullet. For a moment, it seemed he would try to explain himself, but he stopped. With slow steps, he took his blood-stained jacket and headed toward the back door of the apartment. Just before leaving, he stopped to look at her one more time. His lips moved, as if he were going to say something, but finally chose silence. The back door closed behind him, leaving Emma alone in the middle of the room. The silence was now heavier than the knocks on the door. She fell to her knees, covering her face with her hands, unable to contain the tears. She knew the right thing was to let him go, and yet, in her heart, it was no longer so simple. Outside, the men continued shouting his name. The real storm was just beginning. Night fell with a thick fog covering the streets, hiding the silhouettes of those who stalked. Somewhere, far from the warmth of the small room he had abandoned, Ryan walked alone, hunched by the cold, and by a weight greater than any wound. Emma's words followed him like echoes in the darkness. "You lied to me. You used me. Go." He leaned against a damp wall to catch his breath. Each step hurt, but what hurt most was the certainty that he had put her in danger. That humble woman, who had saved him without asking for anything, was paying the consequences of his decisions. He took from his pocket a crumpled paper, an address written by hand, with the time for the next day. It was the appointment he had arranged to hand over the evidence in exchange for his freedom, a trap to end the hunt. The briefcase was well hidden, away from Emma, away from everyone. He knew what he had to do. He would go alone. They would hand him over in exchange for the briefcase. He would probably end up dead, but at least she would be safe. That was enough. That night, under the light rain, he made a silent decision. He would give up his fortune, his name, even his life, if that would keep Emma safe from all this. Meanwhile, in her room, Emma remained sitting on the bed, her eyes swollen from crying. The last time she had seen him, his shoulders seemed heavier than ever. She hugged her knees, trying to convince her heart that she had done the right thing by throwing him out. But the silence brought no comfort. Rather, it left her with a strange emptiness. As if with each passing minute, a part of her knew that he had not only been a threat, he had also been someone willing to break himself for others. She got up suddenly, when she heard a soft knock on the window. But when she looked out, she only found the fog and the empty street. Her gaze was lost in the alley, wondering if he was okay, if he was still breathing, if he would return. And as she sat down again, hands clasped, Emma closed her eyes, and let out a whisper that not even she fully understood. "Please, don't get lost." That same early morning, Ryan arrived at the meeting place, a dark warehouse on the outskirts. There 3 figures waited for him, with sharp smiles and weapons under their coats. He clenched his fists and walked toward them. If he had to sacrifice himself so Emma would be safe, he would do it without hesitation. But what none of them knew yet was that she had also made a decision that night, and she wasn't planning to stand by with her arms crossed. The early morning was an abyss of silence and shadows. When Emma woke up startled, she had tried to sleep, but her heart kept her restless, as if something was calling her from afar. She walked through the empty room, stopping in front of the window. The street was deserted, only the echo of distant sirens broke the quiet. Her gaze fixed on a paper that had fallen to the floor, next to the bed. She bent down to pick it up, and unfolding it, read an address and a time written hastily. Her heart skipped a beat. The appointment was that same night. Without thinking too much, she put on her coat, and went out into the cold early morning, with the crumpled paper in her hands. The street seemed infinite as she ran, dodging puddles and shadows, repeating to herself that she couldn't let him face this alone, not after everything he had done for her. When she reached the outskirts of the city, she stopped in front of an old warehouse. The dim lights inside projected moving silhouettes. 3 men surrounded Ryan, who remained standing, hands raised in a defiant but resigned attitude. "The briefcase," ordered one of them, pointing a gun at him. Ryan smiled with irony, though fear showed in his eyes. "First leave her out of this. She doesn't know anything." Emma couldn't contain herself anymore. She pushed the door and entered, her steps echoing on the concrete floor. "Leave him alone," she shouted, with a voice she didn't even recognize. Everyone turned toward her, surprised. Ryan looked at her with a gesture of horror and desperation. "Go away, Emma," he shouted. "Get out of here." But she was already beside him, placing herself in front of his wounded body, defying the pointed guns. "If you want to hurt him, you'll have to go through me," she said, with trembling but firm courage. The silence in the warehouse was absolute for an instant. The tension was so dense they could barely breathe. One of the men lowered his weapon slightly, amused by her audacity.
Oh.
"You have no idea what you're doing, girl." She looked at him with bright eyes, full of tears and courage. "Yes, I know perfectly." Ryan, beside her, felt his chest fill with a mixture of pain, gratitude and love. He had never seen anyone fight like that for him. "If this moment made you feel something deep, leave your like to support us." And at that instant, as if destiny rebelled, a siren sounded in the distance, and the men became agitated, putting away their weapons to see what was happening outside. Emma and Ryan took advantage to push one of them and run toward the back exit, leaving behind the echo of screams. The cold of the early morning enveloped them, when panting and holding hands, they ran until they were lost in the fog. They didn't know what awaited them beyond that night, but for the first time they felt that at least they were no longer alone. The freezing air of the early morning cut their faces as they ran without looking back. Their steps echoed on the wet pavement, and every shadow on the street seemed like a threat. Emma could barely breathe, but she didn't let go of Ryan's hand. He, despite his wounds, gritted his teeth and kept going, as if her strength was the only thing keeping him on his feet. They turned a corner when an engine roar reached them. The black car was following them closely, headlights on, blinding. The voice of one of the men shouted from the passenger seat, "You have nowhere to run." Ryan pulled Emma, pushing her toward a narrow alley. They took refuge behind a trash container, panting, while the headlights swept the street in front of them. The silence was so tense they could hear each other's heartbeats. He looked at her then, eyes lit with emotion and fear. "You have to leave me now. You can still save yourself." Emma shook her head, clinging to his shirt. "I'm not going to leave you, not after all this." Ryan swallowed, visibly moved. For the first time he let his forehead rest against hers, closing his eyes. "I never imagined that someone could stay by my side like this," he murmured. But there was no time for more. A shot echoed in the street, bouncing off the walls. Ryan felt a burning in his shoulder as he collapsed against the ground. Emma screamed his name, covering him with her body, while bullets continued whistling around them. The back door of a nearby building suddenly opened. An elderly neighbor, awakened by the noise, looked at them surprised and signaled for them to enter. Emma almost dragged Ryan, who could barely stand, inside the building. With the door closed behind them, she sat him on the floor and pressed his wound, trying to stop the blood. Her tears fell uncontrollably as she repeated over and over, "Don't die, please, not now." He raised a trembling hand and placed it on her cheek. "If this is the last thing I have, I don't regret it." The sirens could be heard again, closer. The police were finally arriving, and the men chasing them disappeared among the shadows, knowing they could no longer act without being seen. Emma looked at Ryan, breathing with difficulty, and understood that she had saved him, that they had both saved each other. Outside, the night remained wet and cold, but inside that small improvised room, the warmth of the other was all they needed to continue. For the first time, in the middle of fire and tears, Emma understood what it really meant to be refuge for someone, and that was stronger than any fear. Dawn began to tint the sky with orange and pink tones, as if the city wanted to forget the chaos of the previous night. Inside the small room of the old man who had rescued them, Emma and Ryan remained sitting in silence, next to each other, still breathing with difficulty, but for the first time in a long time, feeling something like peace. Ryan leaned his back against the wall, shirt torn and an improvised bandage covering his wounded shoulder. His gaze was fixed on the floor, eyes glassy, as if trying to order everything that had happened. Beside him, Emma watched him with tenderness, holding his hand between hers, giving him warmth. Neither spoke. There was no need. After what they had lived through, words felt small compared to everything they had both shared in those few nights. Fear, rage, courage, surrender. Emma felt she now knew him more than anyone, even more than he knew himself. He was the first to break the silence, with a barely audible whisper. "You took away all my excuses." She frowned, not understanding. He looked at her then, and there was in his expression a new sincerity, clean, vulnerable. "All my life, I thought no one would stay by my side unless I paid them for it," he confessed. "But you never asked me for anything. You just were there." Emma smiled weakly, with contained tears, because being there sometimes is the only thing someone needs. He lowered his head, unable to hold her gaze, and for an instant his mask of fallen millionaire broke completely. With a broken voice, he added, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for everything you gave me." Emma slid her hand over his and gently shook her head. "You don't have to." Ryan breathed deeply, and closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her fingers comfort him. For the first time in years, he felt he wasn't alone, that even if the whole world collapsed outside, within those humble walls he had found something that money had never given him, a true refuge. She rested her head on his bandaged shoulder, and he carefully rested his on hers. They remained like that for several minutes, listening only to their breathing, knowing that nothing and no one could erase what they had built. Outside, the city woke up with its usual noise, but for them, every second together was a new beginning. Both knew there were still problems to solve, wounds to heal, enemies to face, but the important thing was that they would no longer have to do it alone. And in that silent dawn, in the middle of a stranger's room and peeling walls, Emma and Ryan knew that it didn't matter where they were. As long as they had each other, they would always have a place to return to. The first lights of day illuminated the room with a soft, almost timid glow, slipping through the small window. Outside, the city began to wake up, oblivious to everything that had happened the night before. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window with a long silent sigh. The bandage on his shoulder was still stained, his suit was ruined, and his disheveled hair made it clear that nothing remained of the impeccable millionaire, who had fallen at Emma's doorstep days before. And yet for the first time in years, he felt he was truly breathing. Emma carefully folded the blanket in a corner, and noticing his gaze, gave him a small smile. He extended his hand toward her without saying anything, and she took it, walking until she sat beside him. "Are you sure?" she asked in a low voice, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. He nodded firmly, squeezing her fingers. "There's nothing I want to go back to. Everything that really matters is here." Emma looked at him surprised, then looked down, with a solitary tear escaping from her eye. He lifted her chin gently, forcing her to look at him. "You saved me more times than I can count," he said with a hoarse but sincere voice. "You taught me that money was never a refuge. You are." She smiled through tears and rested her forehead against his. "Then let's go," she whispered. Ryan looked at her with a new gleam in his eyes, full of determination. "Yes, let's go." Minutes later, they left together onto the street, holding hands, leaving behind the shadows that had pursued them. The city stretched before them, bright and chaotic, like a world to rebuild. When crossing the corner, he stopped for an instant to look at her. "Emma," he called her with tenderness. "Thank you for not giving up on me." She returned a warm smile, and without letting go, they both continued walking, disappearing among the people. Because beyond the dirty streets, the lies and the enemies, they had discovered what really mattered, that the true refuge is not the walls, nor the money, nor the escape. The true refuge is who walks beside you when you need it most. And if this story inspired you, subscribe for more stories that touch the soul. The sun began to rise, gradually dispelling the shadows, and although many battles lay ahead, Emma and Ryan already knew that as long as they had each other, they could face any storm, together, always.